Don't touch anything. You'll ruin the table, William Carter said without looking at her, his voice slicing clean through the low hum of a $3 billion dinner deal as crystal glasses hovered midair and the golden light of the private penthouse suite reflected off polished marble like a stage set for power, and Naomi Brooks stood there in silence, a black waitress in a pressed uniform, invisible to everyone who mattered, or at least that's what they thought, because in rooms like this, invisibility wasn't just expected, it was enforced. You don't speak unless spoken to, you don't exist unless needed, and Naomi had mastered that role with precision, moving between chairs and shadows, refilling glasses, catching fragments of conversations worth more than most people's entire lives, and tonight was no different, except it was, because at the center of the table sat William Carter, a man who built empires the way others built sentences, sharp, controlled, final, a white billionaire CEO whose signature alone could move markets by millions before lunch, his tailored suit flawless, his watch worth more than the annual salary of anyone serving him. And yet what truly defined him wasn't the money, it was the certainty, the belief that he owned every room he entered, every person inside it, especially those who served him, and across from him sat investors, partners, men who nodded too quickly and laughed a second too loud, all orbiting his approval, all waiting for the moment he would pick up the pen and close the deal that would change everything. And Naomi saw it all, the subtle tension in their shoulders, the impatience behind polite smiles, the way one man kept glancing at page 3 of the contract as if something there didn't sit right. But no one said a word, because no one wanted to be the one to question William Carter. And then there was Naomi, standing just close enough to hear, just far enough to be dismissed, her posture steady, her expression calm. But her eyes missed nothing, every clause, every number casually mentioned, every assumption left unchecked. And when William reached for the pen, the room leaned forward as one, breaths held, futures waiting on ink. And that's when Naomi spoke, not loud, not dramatic, just precise. You might want to review line 47 before you sign. And just like that, the air shifted. Not loudly, not instantly, but enough for one man across the table to pause, to really look at her for the first time, and in that single moment, the invisible waitress became the only person in the room no one could ignore. No one moved at first, not because they did not hear her, but because they were deciding whether they should, because in rooms like this, power does not just speak, it decides what is worth hearing. And for a brief second, William Carter did what he always did. He ignored her, his pen hovering just above the signature line, his jaw set, his confidence unshaken, until the man across from him leaned forward, slow, deliberate, eyes narrowing as if something invisible had just become visible. Line 47, he repeated, not to her, but to the room, and that was enough, because doubt, once introduced, spreads faster than certainty. And suddenly the contract that had looked perfect seconds ago felt unfinished, fragile, exposed. William exhaled quietly, a controlled breath, then lowered his pen without signing, his fingers tapping once against the paper, a subtle signal that he was still in control, always in control. There is nothing wrong with line 47, he said, calm, dismissive. But he did not sign, not yet, and that hesitation, that fraction of a second pause, it changed everything. Naomi did not move, did not step closer, did not repeat herself. She simply stood there, hands steady, gaze level, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said, and that silence, her silence, carried more weight than any argument. The investor reached for the contract, flipping pages with a precision that cut through the room, eyes scanning, slower now, more careful, until his fingers stopped, and the shift was almost imperceptible, a tightening of the brow, a breath held a moment too long. This clause, he said quietly, it changes the equity structure after 12 months. And just like that, the room tilted, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough for everyone to feel it. William's expression did not break, but something behind his eyes recalibrated, fast, calculating, adjusting to a reality he had not expected. He leaned forward, taking the document back, scanning the same line, the same words he had reviewed, approved, trusted, and yet now they read differently, because someone else had seen them first, someone he had already dismissed. The air grew heavier, thicker. Conversations died before they could start, and for the first time that night, William Carter was not the only one controlling the narrative. "Who told you to say that?" he asked, not loudly, but directly, his eyes finally landing on Naomi, really landing, not as a server, not as background, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, not defiant, not emotional, just certain. "No one," she said, her voice even. "I read it." And the simplicity of that answer unsettled the room more than any accusation could, because it suggested something far more dangerous than defiance. It suggested understanding, and in a room built on power, there is nothing more threatening than someone who understands the rules better than the ones who wrote them. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like a string pulled just short of snapping, every eye shifting between the contract and the woman no one had bothered to see 10 minutes ago. And William Carter leaned back slightly, not retreating, never retreating, but recalibrating, his mind moving faster now, replaying every page, every clause, every assumption he had made walking into this deal, because control, real control, was not about never being challenged. It was about recovering before anyone. "Notice the shift. You read it," he repeated, quieter this time, as if testing the weight of her words, and Naomi did not nod, did not elaborate. She simply held her ground, and that stillness forced the others to fill the silence. The investor across the table adjusted his glasses, scanning again, more carefully now, his voice lower, more cautious. "If this clause activates, your firm loses controlling interest after 12 months. And the words landed differently now, no longer abstract, no longer buried in legal language, but sharp, immediate, real, a future slipping out of someone's hands. And for the first time that evening, the balance of power shifted, not fully, not visibly to everyone, but enough for the energy in the room to tilt toward uncertainty. William's fingers pressed lightly against the table, a measured rhythm, once, twice, then still, his eyes never leaving Naomi, because now she was no longer invisible. She was a problem, and more importantly, she was an unknown. And in his world, unknowns were risks, and risks were either eliminated or understood. "What else did you notice?" he asked, the question controlled, but the implication clear. He was no longer dismissing her. He was evaluating her, and that change, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed by anyone watching. Naomi took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough, and then she spoke again. "The penalty clause on page 5 references a different jurisdiction than the arbitration clause." And the investor's head lifted immediately, eyes widening just slightly, enough to betray that. This was not a guess, not luck, but precision, and suddenly the contract that had been moments away from being signed felt like a trap carefully disguised as opportunity. Murmurs began to form but never fully surfaced, because no one wanted to be the first to admit they had missed it. And in that hesitation, Naomi stood alone, not louder, not higher, but clearer, and William saw it. He saw the pattern. The way she spoke only when it mattered. The way she did not seek attention but commanded it. Anyway, and something unfamiliar crept into his calculation. Not fear, not yet, but recognition. The kind that comes when a system you trusted begins to show cracks. "Who are you?" he asked. And this time the question was not rhetorical, not dismissive. It was direct, necessary, and the room leaned in again, not because they were waiting for her answer, but because they realized they should have asked that question much earlier. And Naomi's expression did not change, not a flicker, not a shift. Just calm, grounded certainty, as if the answer had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The question did not echo. It settled, heavy and deliberate, as if the entire room had been waiting for it without realizing. And Naomi let the silence breathe just long enough for everyone to feel its weight before she answered. Not quickly, not defensively, but with a calm that did not need permission. "Someone who reads before she serves," she said, and a few quiet glances passed between the men at the table, uncertain whether to dismiss her again or finally reconsider everything they thought they understood. And William Carter watched her closely now, not as staff, not as background, but as a variable that had already altered the outcome of his evening. His posture still composed, but his attention sharpened, because control was no longer automatic. It had to be earned back. That is not what I asked, he replied, his tone even, but no longer dismissive, and that difference, small as it was, rippled through the room, because everyone could feel it, the shift from arrogance to awareness, and Naomi did not flinch, did not lower her gaze. She simply met his eyes and said nothing, and that silence, again, forced the room to confront what it had overlooked. The investor across the table leaned back slowly, processing, recalculating, his earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more respectful. She is right, he said finally, tapping the contract lightly, both points. And just like that, the narrative that had been built around William's certainty began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for everyone to see the cracks. William's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he relaxed it again, controlled, measured, always measured. He closed the folder halfway, not rejecting the deal, but no longer rushing it. We will review the document, he said, his voice steady, reclaiming authority where he could, but even that sounded different now, less absolute, more cautious, and in that moment, the room no longer belonged entirely to him, because attention, the most valuable currency in any negotiation, had shifted. It lingered on Naomi, on the woman who had said so little and yet changed so much, and for the first time that night, people looked at her directly, really looked, noticing details they had ignored before, the steadiness in her posture, the quiet confidence in her expression, the absence of hesitation, and those details did not align with the role they had assigned to her. They suggested something else, something they could not yet define, and William saw it too, the mismatch between appearance and presence, between assumption and reality. And that mismatch unsettled him more than any clause in the contract, because it meant there were things in this room he did not control, could not predict, and for a man who built his empire on certainty, that realization was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. You should not be working here, he said suddenly, the statement slipping out before he could filter it, not an insult this time, not quite, but an observation edged with something unfamiliar, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, not confused, not offended, just aware. Maybe you are right, she replied softly, but not for the reasons you think. And that answer did not explain anything, but it changed everything, because now the question was no longer whether she belonged in the room. It was whether the room had been worthy of her all along. The words lingered longer than they should have, not because they were loud, but because they were true in a way no one in the room was prepared to confront, and for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, as if the entire space had been paused by something invisible but undeniable, and William Carter exhaled slowly, his gaze still fixed on Naomi, measuring her, recalculating again, because now the equation had changed. This was no longer about a contract. It was about understanding a presence he had completely misjudged. Then explain, he said, his voice quieter now, not demanding, but searching, and that shift, subtle but real, did not go unnoticed, because power rarely asks questions unless it has to. And Naomi considered him for a second, not weighing her words, but choosing how much of the truth he was ready to hear. You assumed I did not belong here, she said calmly. But you never asked why I was here. And a few of the men around the table shifted in their seats, the discomfort spreading, because her words were no longer directed at one man. They were exposing everyone, and William's expression tightened just slightly, not from anger, but from recognition, the kind that comes when a blind spot is suddenly illuminated. People in your position do not usually read contracts, he replied, attempting to reframe the moment, to regain some structure, some control. But even as he said it, the words sounded weaker than they would have 10 minutes ago, because the evidence standing in front of him contradicted everything he believed, and Naomi gave the smallest hint of a smile, not mocking, not triumphant, just knowing. People in your position do not usually miss clauses like that either, she answered, and this time, no one looked away, because the truth had shifted sides, and it was no longer comfortable. The investor across the table let out a quiet breath, closing the folder fully now, the deal no longer immediate, no longer inevitable, and the weight of that realization settled across the room like a slow storm. William's fingers stopped moving entirely, resting flat against the table, still, controlled, But the stillness now carried tension, not dominance. And for the first time that evening, he was not thinking about winning. He was thinking about what he had missed, and more importantly, who he had missed. "You read this before tonight," he said, more statement than question, and Naomi did not deny it. "Yes," she replied simply, and that single word carried implications no one had yet fully grasped. Because it meant access. It meant awareness. It meant she had been part of something larger than this room, larger than this moment. And William leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in suspicion, but in focus, because now the question was no longer if she mattered, it was how much. "That contract was not public," he said carefully, each word placed with intention. "So how did you see it?" And the room leaned in again, drawn by the gravity of the question, because whatever answer came next would not just explain her presence, it would redefine it. And Naomi held his gaze, steady, unshaken, as if the answer had always been there, waiting for the exact moment when it would matter most. And when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Because it was never just your deal," she said, and the silence that followed was no longer confusion. It was realization beginning to take shape. The words did not land all at once. They unfolded, slowly, like a realization no one could stop once it began. And for the first time that night, no one reached for a glass, no one adjusted their seat, because every instinct in the room said the same thing. "Listen." William Carter did not interrupt. He did not dismiss her. He did not even look away, because something in her tone had shifted from observation to ownership, and that difference carried weight, real weight. "Not just my deal," he repeated quietly, testing the idea, turning it over as if it might reveal a flaw. But Naomi did not correct him. She let the silence stretch again, long enough for the investor across the table to sit up straighter, his expression no longer skeptical but alert, because now this was no longer about a mistake in a contract. This was about structure, about who held the real leverage. And William leaned forward, slower this time, not asserting dominance, but seeking clarity. "Then whose deal is it?" he asked. And the question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like a necessity, because control without understanding is just illusion, and illusions do not survive in rooms like this. Naomi placed the folded cloth in her hand gently on the edge of the table, not as a gesture of service, but as a marker, a quiet signal that she was no longer just passing through. This moment, she was part of it. "The equity clause you overlooked," she said, her voice steady, "was not a mistake." And a subtle shift moved through the room. Not panic, not yet, but awareness, the kind that sharpens every sense. "It was a test," she continued, and now the investor's eyes widened, just slightly, because that word changed everything. A mistake can be corrected, but a test implies intention, design, someone watching, someone waiting, and William's gaze hardened, not in anger, but in focus, because now the situation had escalated beyond negotiation into strategy, and he understood strategy. "A test by who?" he asked. And this time, there was no hesitation, no pause. Naomi met his eyes with the same calm certainty she had carried since the beginning. But now there was something else beneath it, something deeper, something that had been hidden in plain sight. "By the people you thought were not in the room," she said, and the meaning settled heavily, because everyone in that space had assumed the same thing, that power was limited to those seated at the table, that influence wore suits, that authority spoke the loudest, and Naomi had just dismantled all of it with a single sentence. The investor slowly closed the contract, not out of defeat, but out of realization, because whatever this deal had been, it was no longer what it seemed, and William Carter, for the first time in a long time, did not have the next move, not immediately, not clearly, and that absence of certainty pressed against him in a way money never had. "You are saying this was planned," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured than ever, and Naomi gave the smallest nod, not dramatic, not triumphant, just factual. "I am saying," she replied, "you were never the only one making decisions tonight." And the silence that followed was no longer tension, it was recognition, the kind that arrives when the illusion of control finally breaks, not with noise, but with truth. No one spoke because no one wanted to be the first to admit they had misunderstood the entire room. and that realization settled deeper than any mistake ever could. William Carter remained still, but the stillness was no longer control. It was calculation under pressure, his mind moving through possibilities, through angles, through outcomes that no longer aligned with what he had planned walking into that penthouse. Because if this was a test, then he had already failed the part that mattered most: awareness. And across from him, the investor leaned forward again, but not with confidence, with caution, the kind that comes when the ground beneath you shifts without warning. "Who exactly is watching?" he asked, his voice lower now, measured, as if saying it louder might make it worse. And Naomi did not rush to answer. She let the question sit in the air, because now the room understood something it had ignored before. Silence was not absence, it was presence waiting to be recognized. And when she finally spoke, her tone did not change. It did not need to. "The same people who structured the deal," she said, and a flicker of realization crossed the investor's face, quick but unmistakable, because now the pattern was forming. The clause, the jurisdiction shift, the layered conditions, none of it was accidental, none of it was careless, it was deliberate, and William saw it too, faster than the others, because he had built deals like this himself, complex, layered, designed to reward those who understood and expose those who assumed. And for the first time, he was on the other side of that design. "Brooks Holdings," he said quietly, not as a guess, but as a conclusion, and the name carried weight the moment it was spoken, the kind of weight that does not need explanation in a room like this, the kind that shifts power without raising a voice. And Naomi did not confirm it immediately. She simply held his gaze, allowing the truth to settle on its own, because real power does not rush to announce itself. It reveals itself when the room is ready to understand it. And the investor leaned back slowly, the contract now resting untouched in front of him. Because the decision was no longer about signing or not signing. It was about recognizing who actually held the leverage, and William exhaled, controlled, steady, but different now. Not the breath of a man about to win, but of a man adjusting to a reality he had not anticipated. "You knew this would happen," he said, not accusing, not defensive, but certain, and Naomi gave a small nod, not proud, not apologetic, just honest. "I knew you would not read it carefully enough," she replied, and that sentence did more than challenge him. It exposed him, not in front of the world, but in front of the only audience that mattered, the ones who understood what had just happened. And for a moment, William said nothing, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to deny, only something to accept, and acceptance, in his world, was the first step toward adapting. But before he could speak again, the investor closed the folder completely and placed his hand on top of it, a quiet, decisive gesture. "We are not proceeding tonight," he said, and the finality in his voice left no room for negotiation, no room for recovery, at least not immediately. And the silence that followed was no longer tense. It was definitive, because the outcome had shifted, not through force, not through volume, but through understanding. And Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, calm, steady, unchanged, as if the entire room had moved around her, not the other way around. The decision did not echo. It settled, final and unmoving, like a door closing without sound. And for a moment, no one reached for anything, not a glass, not a pen, not even a word, because the reality was already clear. The deal was not paused. It was broken, not by force, not by confrontation, but by something far more precise, understanding. And William Carter sat there, still composed, still upright, but no longer untouched by the moment, his eyes shifting briefly to the contract, then back to Naomi, as if trying to reconcile the version of the night he had expected with the one unfolding in front of him. "You could have said nothing," he said quietly, not as a challenge, not even as a complaint, but as a realization, because silence would have preserved everything for him. And Naomi considered that for a second. Not because she doubted herself, but because she understood exactly what he meant. "Yes," she replied simply, and the weight of that answer carried further than any explanation could, because it revealed choice, intention, and something else, something William was only beginning to recognize: restraint. The investor across the table stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, his posture no longer tense, but resolved. We will revisit this when the structure is clearer, he said, choosing his words carefully, but the message underneath was unmistakable. The terms would not move forward as they were, not anymore, not after what had been exposed, and one by one, the others followed, chairs shifting softly against the polished floor, quiet movements that marked the end of something that had felt inevitable just minutes ago. And through it all, Naomi did not move, did not step back into the shadows, because there were no shadows left for her to return to, not in this room, not after this moment, and William watched it unfold, not with frustration, not with anger, but with something far more unfamiliar, respect forming in real time, uninvited but undeniable. You changed the outcome of a $3 billion deal, he said, his voice low, steady, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. No, she said softly. I revealed it. And that distinction lingered, sharp and undeniable, because outcomes do not change without reason. They are uncovered, exposed, and in that moment, William understood something he had overlooked his entire career. That power is not just about control, it is about awareness, and awareness had just cost him more than any negotiation ever had. The room was nearly empty now, the lights still warm, the table still set, but the atmosphere completely different, stripped of its earlier certainty, and William stood slowly, not rushed, not defeated, just present in a way he had not been before, his attention still on Naomi, because now the question was no longer about the deal, it was about her. You said it was not for the reasons I think, he reminded her, his tone measured, almost reflective. So tell me. And Naomi looked at him, not as a waitress, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had been part of the structure all along. Because I was never here to serve the table, she said, her voice calm, grounded. I was here to see who deserved to sit at it. And for the first time that night, William Carter did not respond immediately, because some answers do not require words, they require understanding, and understanding takes time. The room did not return to what it was, it could not, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and William Carter stood there in the quiet aftermath, the polished table still set for a deal that no longer existed, the golden light now revealing more than it concealed. And for the first time in years, he was not thinking about numbers, not thinking about leverage, but about a single moment he could not undo. The moment he chose not to look, not to ask, not to see, and Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she had been all along, steady, composed, unchanged by the shift that had unsettled everyone else, because for her, nothing had changed. This was always the plan, always the purpose, and William took a slow step forward, not as a command, not as a display, but as a decision. I misjudged you, he said, the words measured, deliberate, not easy, but real, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, not waiting for the apology, not needing it. You misjudged the room, she replied, her voice calm, and that correction landed deeper than the admission itself, because it was not personal, it was structural. It was about how he saw power, how he defined it, how he assumed it would always look the same. And for a moment, William almost smiled, not out of humor, but recognition, because he understood now. This was not about being wrong once. It was about a pattern he had built his entire career on, a pattern that had finally failed him, and he nodded slowly, accepting it, not fully, not yet, but enough to know he could not ignore it again. Brooks Holdings, he said quietly. The name no longer a guess, no longer a distant entity, but something immediate, something present, and Naomi did not deny it. She did not confirm it with words. She simply reached into the pocket of her uniform and placed a simple card on the table. No flourish, no emphasis, just a quiet action that carried undeniable weight, and William looked down at it, not rushing, not reacting, just taking it in, the name, the title, the reality of what had been in front of him the entire time. And when he looked back up, something had shifted, not dramatically, not completely, but enough for the room to feel different, even in its emptiness. You came here to evaluate me, he said. And this time, it was not a question, and Naomi gave a small nod. Among other things, she answered. And the simplicity of that response carried more depth than any explanation could, because it suggested layers, decisions beyond this night, consequences beyond this table. And William exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marks the end of one understanding and the beginning of another. And your conclusion? He asked, not defensively, not urgently, but honestly, because now, for the first time, he wanted to know, and Naomi looked at him, not with judgment, not with superiority, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to prove itself. You are used to being the most powerful person in the room, she said, her voice steady. But tonight showed you something else, and she paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle. Power is not who speaks the loudest, it is who understands the most. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, because nothing more needed to be said, and William Carter stood there, in a room he no longer owned, holding a lesson he could not buy, could not negotiate, could only learn. And Naomi turned to leave, not rushed, not dramatic, just certain, because she had done what she came to do. And as the door closed softly behind her, the room did not feel smaller, it felt clearer, and for the first time that night, the man who had everything understood exactly what he had been missing.